Well, I mean, scripture is really clear. We're not exempt from suffering. If I am careful when I read the text, both Jesus, who says, be anxious for nothing, and Paul, who says almost the same words, Jesus in the Gospels, in the Sermon on the Mount, Paul in Philippians, they both say, be anxious for nothing. And yet both of them in the text itself, both in Jesus' life, you'll find it in the Gospels, and in Paul's life, both of them wrestled with profound anxiety at a specific point in their life. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't wrestle with it at other times, but Jesus collapsed under the weight of the anxiety that he felt in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he sweat, as it were, drops of blood. His blood pressure increased to the point where the capillary is close to his skin from the anxiety of becoming aware. Now he's God and man at the same time, so he has the capacity to defer any of that. It's not until he gets to Gethsemane that he allows the weight of what is about to happen to impact him at a level of his psyche. And he sweats, as it were, drops of blood. So he's actually beginning to redeem us in the agony of the trauma that he experiences psychologically and spiritually in the garden. Paul talks about despairing of life with the Corinthians and having a sentence of death. He speaks of being with them in weakness and in fear and in much trembling. These are all ancient terms to describe not only some sort of a metaphor, but these are Paul describing the state he was in. And he gives us a little bit of insight in 2 Corinthians 1 as to how excessively burdened he was to despair even of life. And so these are not unusual. And if you go through the history of the church fathers, you'll discover many of them speak of a dark night of the soul. John Cassian goes into great detail and speaks of a dark night of the soul. There's also a dark night of the spirit. And so they emphasize the differences between the two. I think if I were to describe mine, as I do in the book, I had been through a dark night of the soul long before I went through this season. This would have been more of a dark night of the spirit. There was the total abandonment of a sense of Christ in my consciousness. I knew God was there. I had enough theology and history with God to know God wouldn't leave me, but the conscious awareness of his abiding presence was withdrawn. And in its place, I was left with processing my afflictive negative thoughts and feelings and the profound sense of the powers assailing my soul, the princes and powers going after me, while I was also sorting through my own issues at the time.
I think the thing that I have loved coming out of a background of kind of a name it and claim it world is the vulnerability and honesty that I've experienced either when I've met you personally or when I read some of your work and heard you preach. I would love you just to, in terms of the number one dynamic that helped you move from a complete sense of Christ is not with me, I don't feel him in me or around me in that sense, that helped you shift some of your, not just perspective, but the sense of connection. I'm thinking there have been moments when I have, if I had to be honest, being in spaces where I've done things out of duty and out of mechanism rather than sense of encounter in a ministry time. And you know, from what I've read and what it sounds like, you carried on doing what you needed to do in the midst of it.
I had to keep functioning. I had to keep functioning.
Yeah. What do we do in those moments? What was one of the key shifters for you?
Well, I mean, I don't know that there was one key. There were many things. Obviously, I was profoundly depressed. I was dealing with extreme anxiety, and both of those combined gave me chronic insomnia. So for 3.5 years, I had to exist without much of any sleep. I had to do all the practical things. I lost 30 pounds from the stress and the anxiety. There was a perpetual knot in my stomach. Yet I still had to function. I had to travel. I had to speak. People, for all intents and purposes, other than my local church, didn't know what I was going through. But I needed help. But I think I had to learn how to face those negative, afflictive thoughts and feelings and face them in a way that I didn't allow them to define me. That's easier said than done, because there were a number of stressors that triggered the event. Some of them that I disclose in the book, some of them I'm really careful not to disclose because I want to preserve, a certain amount of privacy because of some of my family members. But the stressors were pretty intense, and any one of them would have been enough to take me out. But there was a combination of about four. It was a perfect storm. I say in the book, if I had seen the bus coming, I'd have gotten out of the way.
Yeah.
But I had to choose to put one foot in front of another. I knew enough to know that I had to walk by faith. But it wasn't easy putting one foot in front of another and saying, God, I trust you in spite of what I see. I did, but it was really tough going because I felt as if God had turned a deaf ear. And I felt like C.S. Lewis when he wrote A Severe Mercy. I felt it was a severe mercy. I'm just being honest. It was, I found myself in a lot of David's complaining in a third of the Psalms of David that are Psalms of lament and complaint. I learned from that, but it was not something I'd wish on my worst enemy.